Good afternoon, and welcome to the S.J. Hall Lecture on Industrial Forestry. I'm David Ackerley, Dean of the Rausser College of Natural Resources. I'm very pleased to be with all of you here this afternoon and looking forward to our panel discussion entitled Tribal Forest Management, the Intersection of Industrial and Indigenous Forest Management. I want to acknowledge today that although we are all attending this lecture in different places, we are all on native lands. We here in Berkeley are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. Recognition is a small gesture, and we hope to make it more meaningful as we continue to develop authentic relationships with Indigenous people and take informed actions based on these relationships. This is, of course, once again, an exceptional year in our relation to California forests, especially, of course, with another round of wildfires that have exceeded even our, the peak years in the recent past. And all of this, the attention of all of us who care about forests, and of course, to all of us across the society, bring our attention to the importance of everything about how we manage our forests, its relation to human well-being, to livelihoods, and increasingly, of course, to attention about its role in carbon storage and carbon sequestration. So our panelists will get into all the details, but I simply want to acknowledge how widely shared the deep interests and commitments are to a better understanding of our forests and how we manage them. I'm sure we also have many Cal Forestry alumni on the line. Welcome, all of you. I'm so sorry we didn't see you at camp at our traditional alumni gathering. I actually did happen to take a short vacation and got up there and popped into Sea Camp. It's very well, it was very quiet. I actually climbed Spanish Peak for the first time this summer. And I don't think that's quite enough to make me maybe an honorary member of Cal Forestry. And we look forward to being back again next year. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to give you some background on the S.J. Hall Lecture Series and its namesake, Sherwood J. Hall. Upon acquiring his Bachelor of Science in Forestry from New York State University, Syracuse in 1920, Hall entered the forestry profession as a consultant in the South for the James D. Lacey Company. And in 1931, he formed Forest Managers, Inc., where he both managed forests and advised other forest land owners. One of his clients was J.C. Penney, whom he aided in sculpting barren land into a forested home for a retirement center. Hall played a major role in the development of industrial forestry in the South before moving to the West in 1948, where he was one of the first to recognize the potential of the West Coast's young growth timber stands. Accordingly, Hall and two partners acquired a 27,000-acre cutover redwood tract, establishing the Gualala Redwoods Company. The company quickly emerged as a leader in the industrial management of young growth redwood land, practicing sustained yield forestry. Upon Hall's death in 1968, his widow, Mrs. Desi Hall, moved to create the Forest Economics Foundation to advance the understanding and practice of sound economic principles among forestry students. Later that year, she established the S.J. Hall Lectureship in Industrial Forestry and the S.J. Hall Chair in Forest Economics here at UC Berkeley. Professor Matthew Potts is the current holder of the S.J. Hall Distinguished Chair, and he's here with us this evening. Normally, I would ask him to wave his hand, and here we are in webinar mode, and unfortunately cannot see the others who are attending. Hall felt strongly that economic understanding is basic to effective forestry and to a strong nation. And it is in keeping with that sentiment that we hold this annual lecture. Berkeley will be able to hold this annual event and continue to support our world-renowned programs in forest management and economics in perpetuity, thanks to the generosity and foresight of Desi Hall. This afternoon, I would like to welcome and recognize members of the Hall family who have made it a tradition to participate in this annual event. Desi's daughter, Susan Hall, is here in the sense that she's listening in, as well as Susan's nephew and Desi's grandson, Kenneth Hall, and Ken is joined by his wife, Patty. Welcome to all of you, and again, I'm sorry we're not seeing you again in person this year. Following this afternoon's panel, there will be a 30-minute Q&A session. At any time during the panel discussion, audience members may submit questions in the YouTube chat or via the Facebook Live link that is provided below on the screen. Questions submitted during the panel discussion will be shared with the moderator, who will present them to the panel when the Q&A session begins. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's panel. Early today, we received word that our scheduled moderator, Peter Wakeland, has a family emergency and cannot be with us this afternoon. We wish him and his family well. We're very fortunate that Don Motanik has stepped in to moderate this afternoon's panel discussion on very short notice. Don Motanik has been a technical specialist with the Intertribal Timber Council since 1995. Don has spent most of his 42-year career as a forest engineer and forest manager with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, living and working with the Yakama Nation, Umatilla, and Spokane tribes. He has been involved with Native youth through numerous groups, including the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, Wisdom of the Elders, Washington Ag Forestry Leadership Foundation, Washington State University, Vancouver Native Advisory Council, Society of American Foresters, and Big Brothers and Big Sisters. Don holds a Bachelor's of Science in Forest Engineering from the University of Washington. We're pleased to have three experts joining Don on this afternoon's panel. Tim Hayden has been the Deputy Executive Director of Natural Resources for the Yurok tribe since 2015, having started his career in the tribe's fishery department nearly 25 years ago. He currently oversees all Yurok natural resource departments and programs and leads tribal efforts on resource management planning, environmental compliance, and carbon project management on recently purchased Yurok lands. Mr. Hayden serves on the CAL FIRE Native American Advisory Committee and was recently selected to serve on the California Air Resources Board's Carbon Offsets Task Force. Mr. Hayden holds a Bachelor's of Science from Humboldt State University's Fisheries Department. Our second panelist, Dr. Mike Dockery, is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and a member of the Intertribal Timber Council's Research Subcommittee. Dr. Dockery is an assistant professor in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota, an affiliate faculty member in the American Indian Studies Department, and a fellow at the U of M Institute on the Environment. Dr. Dockery supports tribal sovereignty and works to foster collaborative and respectful research relationships. His research supports interdisciplinary, sustainable natural resource management to meet community goals and focuses on incorporating Indigenous knowledge into forestry and natural resource management, supporting tribal sovereignty and addressing tribal environmental issues. Dr. Dockery earned a BS and PhD in forestry from the University of Wisconsin, as well as an MS in forest resources from Pennsylvania State University. Dawn Blake rounds out this afternoon's panel. Ms. Blake has worked for over a decade in the Hoopa Valley Tribe's forestry program and is currently the tribe's wildlife biologist, while also continuing to work directly with tribal forest managers on the timber sale process. Ms. Blake recently received her MS in wildlife from Humboldt State University, and she also sits on the board of directors of the Hoopa Tribal Education Association. And now it's my pleasure to invite our moderator, Don Motanik, to begin the evening panel discussion. Don, take it from here.
Thank you, David. Tatskalap, Katsiao, that's good afternoon, and thank you in Nez Perce language. It's my grandmother's language that we speak at home or speak, and I'm enrolled with the Confederated Tribes Umatilla Indian Reservation on my father's side, and my mother's Coeur d'Alene. So I do have French heritage, so I am really kind of an intertribal person that works with the Intertribal Timber Council, but would like to thank the University of California and the S.J. Hall lecture series to provide a forum for tribal forestry, the intersection of industry and indigenous forest management. we have our 3 panel members today, but one of the things I was going to spend the next 15 minutes is to give an overview to the to everybody here of a little bit of background, a national background on tribal forestry nationwide, and talking about 3 topics. One is on governance. Another one is talking about the Indian forest land itself nationwide, some of the parts of the nation where our forests are located nationwide. And then the third thing I'll be talking about is kind of the management philosophy that can be looked at somewhat nationwide, but we have our 3 panelists that'll be getting into talking about how each tribe is really unique and different. Talking about the governance, one of the things that I make a presentation at the World Forestry Center up in Portland, Oregon, is we do have Indigenous members come from around the world, and they look at a map of the United States, and they see the states, but also there's a map of reservations on the United States, and they always make a question we get from all the Indigenous people is why are the reservations located where they are? They see small reservations, large reservations, maybe no reservations. And I think if you could close your eyes and imagine a map of the United States, and if you look on the, you'll see very few reservations east of the Mississippi, and then you'll see reservations to the north around the Great Lakes states, and you'll see reservations to the southwest and many up in the northwest, and some in California, and all these reservations were established a relationship between the United States and the tribes. But one of the things today that talking about this past history is hopefully creating a common memory. George Erasmus, a Canadian, or a up in Canada, one of their national leaders, talked about creating a common memory where common memory is lacking there, and where people don't share a common memory, there can be really no community. But the only time we can really commute our real community is to share our common memory. So one of the things that today we'll be able to share with some of our native presenters today is some of that common memory to create a common community. But as I mentioned, with the governance between the United States and the tribes, and how these, I call it 3 parts of the United States that were established with the documented discovery is something that was is how our United States was established, and how that documented discovery actually today affects the laws that we have with our tribes, and even it ties into tribal forestry. We will have, in my presentation anyway, we'll have some of those documents. A professor, Robert J. Miller, a professor from, Indian law professor from Arizona State University. He's written a book about the doctrine of discovery, and he has like 59 papers on the documented discovery. And for students and people that are interested in looking at or seeing how the documented discovery had a real impact on how the reservations were set up, and really an impact on our tribal forestry, we'll have that documents listed with this video. But when you look at the Doctrine of Discovery, it's one of the main things. It's based on watersheds. When the three of the main countries that established the claims, the English, the Spanish, and the French, would plant a flag at the mouth of a river like the Mississippi River and the Columbia River and the various rivers in the United States, and they would actually claim that whole watershed for their country. And in the Northwest, it was the English and the United States. In the Southwest, which was part of how California was established, is actually where the Spanish Doctrine of Discovery had the biggest impact on how California and the reservations. But as I mentioned before, we'll have documents that'll reference kind of how the governance is. And that governance kind of ties into the management of the forests of the United States, of looking at where the largest forests are in the country. It's really divided into two parts. That there's kind of the lake states, 10%, or excuse me, 25% of the tribal volume of forests up in lake states, about 10 million board feet. There's actually 44 billion board feet in the United States on 19 million acres, and 10 billion board feet is up in the lake states. And the Southwest and the West, 75% of that volume is in the West, where there are a lot of fires. So there's like 30 billion board feet in the West where the tribes have their timber. And to manage those forests, one of the things that people don't understand with managing tribal forests, the tribes receive funding from the federal government. The trust responsibility of the tribes of the United States with the tribes is that the tribes receive 1/3 of the funding as compared to the Forest Service. There's an independent assessment of Indian forest lands, and when they did their study, they were comparing the cost of managing forests between the Forest Service and the tribes. And the tribes receive one third of the funding, and it's about $9 an acre for the Forest Service and $3 an acre for the tribes. So the tribes are managing their forests at 1/3 of the costs, but the tribes still are following the federal laws as far as some of the environmental protection regulations. They're different. It is a National Environmental Protection Act laws, but the regulations between the Forest Service and how the tribes follow the Bureau of Indian Affairs laws are different. And that's one of the unique things. Managing land is following the regulations. They're different between the Forest Service with the Department of Agriculture, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is in the Department of Interior. That gives you maybe a little bit of background. I've just covered some of the governance of how the land was established between the United States and the tribes, and how the reservations were established with either treaties, executive orders, or statutes passed by Congress. Are the three ways that the reservations have been established. And I mentioned the little bit about the forest acreage of the 19 million acres of forest land. the 44 billion board feet of standing timber. And the next thing, or kind of in closing here with the final 5 minutes, is really talking about what, as I mentioned before, is Congress is always Congress, or the tribes testify in front of Congress. And one of the questions that they realize that they realize or they hear that the tribes are managing the forest at 1/3 of the cost. And Congress will ask the tribal people that are testifying, why is that? And they're looking for like an answer that would be easy, that they could use with maybe utilize and share with the Forest Service. But each tribe has their own way of management, and it's unique. It's unique. One of the things of even Gifford Pinchot talked about. The first duty of the human race is to control nature, and the tribes really don't view the forest as them controlling it, but there's a reciprocity. It's working with the forest and adapting with the forest. Even with our tribal language, one of the important things that it's hard to describe a lot of the tribal philosophies because tribal language is much trying to explain different than English, because the tribal language itself is just the opposite of the English language. The English language is 70% noun and 30% verb, and tribal language in general is 70% verb and 30% noun. And when I talk with some of my elders that speak the language, they always say I have to think opposite, and trying to express the difference or the connections between economics and the environment. Those things are really hard to connect. One of the authors that does a pretty good job of this is Robin Kimmer, Dr. Robin Kimmer. And if you have an opportunity, I'd recommend reading the book, Braiding Sweetgrass. That's something that Robin Kimber really does a great job of explaining this difference, and the other thing that tribes economy is based on a gift economy versus capitalism that we think of. In the United States, there's a Bill of Rights, and in our tribal community, we have a Bill of Responsibilities. You have responsibilities versus rights, and when you have to balance those two things of being responsible, I know in our tribal communities that our responsibility for our future, for our children, for our environment is always more important than our rights. It's our responsibility that we have for our environment, which is it's hard to explain sometimes, but what I call each tribe in their language, those values are based in their language. So that's one reason why the tribes are different with their philosophy of management, is that their language and culture is different. And I, as an engineer, when we were designing bridges, we had a factor of safety. A lot of times it was common to have a factor of safety of 3. And I think each tribe with its own values has its own factor of safety. That you can have an allowable cut to one set. You can describe a scientific allowable cut and a biological cut, but that's like building a bridge. You can build a bridge with with strength that was just enough to get a truck across. But what's that factor of safety? And I think tribes look at their harvest, but they say, well, what we need our protection, we need our factor of safety, and I think that's what each tribe provides. So that's in short. I talked about governance. Professor Robert Miller and his papers will provide you more information about that. Our land and management. We have an assessment of Indian forest land that describes the 190 or the 19 million acres, how that's managed, the assessment that's done every 10 years. And then as far as philosophy, again, recommend Dr. Robin Kimmer's, her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And she goes in great detail of talking about the tribe's gift economy, the responsibilities, and instead of control, it's the reciprocity that we're not controlling nature, but we're part of nature. And I think that's why tribes are able to adapt better. And I think that's where we'll go into transition. Speaking of adaptability and our unique opportunities to hear from our tribal panel today on how they look at managing their timber. So our next speaker will be Tim, and Tim will be talking about an overview of the Yurok tribe's timber management program. So go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Don. I really appreciate the overview of tribal forest management. I think that's a good context for folks. So let me start. I'll give our viewers a little context and some background about the Yurok tribe. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Tim Hayden. I'm the Deputy Executive Natural Resources Director for the Yurok tribe. The Yurok tribe is located in Northern California, up in Humboldt County and Del Norte County. We're the largest tribe in California with over 6,200 enrolled tribal members. The reservation extends roughly 42 miles on the lower Klamath River, extending from the confluence of the Trinity River downstream to the Pacific Ocean. The reservation itself is really centered around the river. It extends roughly a mile or so on each side of the river. And the Yurok tribe, we've of course been around since time immemorial. And over the years, the tribe has gone through a lot of changes. As Don mentioned, the different ways reservations are established. Our reservation was established by executive order, and over time and several different lawsuits, the Yurok tribe was formally established as an independent tribe, and in 1993 drafted and ratified its constitution. The constitution is really important to the Yurok tribe, of course. It established our tribal council and our governance structure. It also established some of our initial tribal departments, including our forestry department and our fisheries department. But it also laid out some really important vision for the tribe. And one of those was to repatriate lost lands and to restore tribal land, our tribal land base. So it's really is fundamental to the tribe, and our mission for natural resources management is to restore our land base, and as Don really described well, fulfill that stewardship role and that responsibility for managing those lands. The Yurok tribe is really a river people. They have federally recognized fishing rights on the Klamath and Trinity rivers. We have a very very large, well, in some years, and not recently, but we've had good fish runs. We have federally recognized rights to fish for commercial fisheries, for ceremonial purposes, and for subsistence purposes. So fishing is really important to the Yurok tribe, but managing our forested lands is just as important. Um, when the tribe was initially, the Constitution was established and ratified in 1993, and some of the very first departments that were formed were our fisheries and our forestry departments. Um, and so historically, our forestry department has really focused on managing, sustainable timber management on our tribal trust lands. Uh, Although the Yurok Reservation includes about 100,000 acres of lands in total, the Yurok tribe itself really, unfortunately, it doesn't own a lot of those lands. Over the years, we've lost a lot of lands through, a lot of, unfortunately, shady circumstances. We've lost lands to private timber companies. And so the forestry department really focused on managing what remaining trust lands were intact. So we have roughly around 6,000 acres of trust lands on the reservations. And then, of course, there's probably around 10,000 acres of other allotments and other various tribal lands that within the reservation. So one of our goals, though, has really been to, as I mentioned, repatriate those lost lands, both within the reservation and across our tribal, ancestral territory, which is quite vast. So historically, we focused on managing those trust timber resources and have worked closely with the BIA, as Don mentioned, with very limited resources. We're a self-governance tribe, but it's really is a challenge to manage those lands, with those limited resources. And we've worked very hard to develop a real professional forest management team, and of course, over the years, we've tried to grow that capacity by working with our tribal members and helping our tribal members go to college and other things, and to try to train them and mentor them into leadership positions. But one of the things that has been really exciting over the last 10 years is we've been working with some of our partners. We've been working with a private timber company that owns a majority of our lands, both on the reservation and adjacent to the reservation. And we've been working with them to negotiate land acquisition agreements. So starting in 2013, we purchased our first large land acquisition of about 9,000 acres in a property we call our Cook Kapala lands. And it was very interesting how that came to be. And it's a long backstory, but what's really interesting is the way that we've funded those acquisitions. That property was actually, at the same time, the California Air Resources Board was working to develop the California Cap and Trade program. We reached out and engaged the Air Resources Board and were interested in potentially participating in the program. The state at that time really hadn't anticipated an interest or really how can tribes participate in the program. So we began to work with them, and in the end, the tribes were deemed to be eligible to participate in the program. So on that property, we actually work with several other partners. We've been working with a group called the Western Rivers Conservancy, really great folks, and others. And we developed actually the very first forest carbon project in California. So that was a really big step for the Yurok tribe, and really we learned a lot. And I think what we continued our work and our partnership with this timber company and this partnership with Western Rivers Conservancy. And we ultimately developed two other large-scale acquisitions, both around 25,000 acres, and using some very creative financing, taking advantage of a new market tax credit program, and other creative financing mechanisms. We basically have repatriated those lands and done it the hard way. We've had to buy them back. But for both of those lands, what we've done is develop forest carbon projects. So we're using those funds to both, finance the properties, but also to manage those lands. We're very complex agreements. We have we have many different management agreements for depending on the acquisition, but overall, what we want to do is develop, sustainable forest management plans, integrate endangered species, habitat management. We want to manage our property for fish, for wildlife, and then of course the carbon projects themselves, which have really been beneficial to the tribe in a lot of ways. And as I think our opening statement talked about, how managing the tribe's lands and actively managing it has really, helped us achieve some of those self-governance and self-determination goals that we really are important to the tribe. So there's still a lot of challenges. We want to continue, our work to acquire more lands. There's a lot of jurisdictional and permitting challenges, and of course, funding is always an issue. But I think we've got a real good strategy, and we're hoping to share that with other tribes. And if there's folks that are interested, I feel welcome then to reach out, and we can definitely coordinate. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Let folks know if you have any questions, please place them in the chat box, and then we'll have a question and answer session. But now we'll move on to our next speaker, Don Blake, and Don Blake will give us an overview of the Hoopa Valley Tribes Timber Management Program. So go ahead, Don.
Thank you for the introduction, Dawn, and thank you for the overview, Tim. I'm really compelled by what the Yurok tribe is doing lately in forest management, and just the land acquisition is really compelling and important piece. And just the fact that it really seems like your tribe is unified in these goals, I find that really compelling. My name's Dawn Blake. I'm from the Hoopa tribe. I'm a Hoopa tribal member, but I also have ties to the Yurok tribe. My mom's an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe. My grandmother and a grandfather were full-blooded Yurok tribal members. Anyway, I'm a wildlife biologist, and I've been working at Hoopa Tribal Forestry for the last I think it's nearing 20 years now. I got a Bachelor's of Science from Humboldt State University, and then recently received a Master's of Science from Humboldt State University, and I studied pileated woodpeckers. So within the Tribal Forestry Department, we have several divisions, and one of them is wildlife, and that's where I work. But we work closely with the timber sale process, and I often find myself out in the field with foresters, looking at potential saved trees, and just we all really work together well, and we're governed by our forest management plan. So our forest management plan was developed in the early 90s when the Hoopa tribe participated in a demonstration project. We were among the first 9 tribes to claim self-governance. So shortly after that, we developed our forest management plan. The BIA managed timber on our reservation before we developed our own forest management plan and took over management. So that happened before I got to forestry, but that's the legacy that really compelled me to want to be at forestry, because the forest management plan was well written, and my understanding of it was just that. The BIA, like other agencies during that time, was really mostly solely concerned with timber production and revenue, and the tribe didn't really feel like they gave enough attention to our cultural resources and things that were actually important to us, such as basketry, acorn production, and the multi-uses of the forest that we've always had a relationship with. And so when we took over management of the forest, we incorporated those things into our forest management plan. And one of the things that always compelled me was that we managed for woodpeckers by making sure to leave as many snags on the landscape as was possible to not I guess a lot of places remove snags because they can be dangerous. So as long as it's not dangerous to leave snags, we try to leave every snag on the landscape that we possibly can, and that's for woodpecker habitat. Let's see, what else? So in forestry, we manage, the reservation is adjacent to the Yurok Reservation, where approximately 300 miles north of San Francisco and 90 miles south of the Oregon border, and we're abutted up to the Yurok Reservation. The Trinity River essentially bisects the Hoopa Valley Reservation, and we have a pretty productive fisheries program, and like Tim said, fishing rights, and those things are important to us. So those kinds of things really lend to the way that we manage the forest. We want to ensure that there's always fish and always the things that we utilize and that we have a relationship with, and so this has been a good job for me here. I feel like I get a lot of I get a lot of satisfaction out of working for my own tribe, for my people, and feeling like I'm part of this stewardship that has always been important to us in managing. So lately we have been we've been thinking more about fire and the threats of fire. We always managed with fire and haven't been able to really in the last 100 or so years. And so we are participating in a lot of fuels reduction projects, and some of those are through stewardship agreements. We had a stewardship agreement with the Bureau, the BLM, just outside of the reservation on the west side of our reservation. And our personnel went outside the reservation and helped to reduce fuels and cut, stack, and pile fuels that would eventually be burned, so that area that is adjacent to our reservation wouldn't be a threat. And so this stewardship agreement was, helpful to both BLM and to the tribe, in that it reduced the fuel that could potentially lend to catastrophic fire. And so then recently we've partnered with the Forest Service for the same thing on the eastern edge of our reservation. Um, so that didn't feel like a very long discussion. I genuinely don't like public speaking. So for my master's study, I studied pileated woodpeckers, and I compared the habitat and the use of the habitat in relation to the different cereal stages of the forest as we've cut. So old growth forest and newly cut forest and stem exclusion forest. I don't remember how many. I'm nervous, so I don't remember exactly how many of those different cereal stages I included in my study, but that was what I looked at for pileated woodpeckers. Okay. So I'll wrap that up.
Yeah, Don, I was just wondering, do you know, like you mentioned, the partnerships, do you remember how the partnerships started in the meetings in the beginning versus how the meetings go now, how they've changed over time?
Well, over time, I that's not really my expertise, and I didn't have a lot to do with those meetings. I wasn't in the meetings. I just knew that we had them, and these partnerships were a new thing. I think that there was not a discussion before something that you mentioned earlier when we were discussing this. There was a landmark thing that took place that enabled us to have these discussions with these other agencies and go into these partnership agreements with them.
Okay, thank you, Don. Appreciate that. There are some starting to become some themes of sovereignty and partnerships as far as restoration. So we'll move on to our last panel member, and that's Mike Dockery. Will be talking about the Menominee tribe. So go ahead, Mike.
Great. Bozo, everybody. It's really nice to be here with you. I'm, as was said, I'm Mike Dockery. I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi tribe. Our traditional territories are around the southern part of Lake Michigan, and we were removed from there in the 1830s over to Kansas and then down to Oklahoma, where we have our tribal lands today. I was born and raised in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and that's within the Menominee territory. And I had a real honor and a privilege to work with the Menominee tribe for 8 or 9 years or so, working with the College of Menominee Nation and the U.S. Forest Service. So I got to learn a lot about how Menominee manages their forests and think about it. And I like to tell Menominee's story because it's really important for all of us to ground ourselves in sustainable forestry and where sustainable forestry really started in the United States. A couple of things before I start telling the story here. I'll just reiterate what we heard. All lands were once Indian lands here in the United States, and we need to remember that. We're hearing this right now as well. All of our tribes are different. We have a lot of diversity among the tribes. We have diversity within the tribe. So we all have different perspectives, different knowledges within the tribe and among the tribes. So that's important to remember as well. And I think Tim was saying this pretty clearly. We've managed these lands over generations that have and experienced many, many changes. So changes from Potawatomi perspective, for example, going from the southern part of Lake Michigan to Oklahoma. That's massive environmental change, massive social changes. Our social dynamics are changing, cultural dynamics, massive economic changes as well. And so we've managed through these changes, and we're still here, and we're still managing our forests and our lands according to our own values and our own perspectives and our own goals. And as Don mentioned, Robin Kimmerer's work, our goals really come out of our tribal values. So I'd like to talk about Menominee, just to kind of share with you. If you go to Google Earth and look at Wisconsin, and you see the satellite image, Menominee tribal members often talk about this image. You can look at the satellite photograph and see the outline of the reservation, basically in forest. And that's kind of north of Green Bay, Wisconsin, so northeast Wisconsin. Menominee have been harvesting timber, milling timber into lumber since the 1850s. 1854 and 1856 were when the two final treaties that they signed with the US government, and they started managing forests at that point. The reservation is about 230,000 acres, and 97% or so, 95% is forest land dedicated to sustained yield forestry. That comes through the tribal constitution, and their documents, their laws basically tell them that they have to manage their land sustainably. When they were signing those treaties, if you talk to Menominee people today and you ask, how do you think about forestry? Very, very quickly you start hearing stories about Chief Oshkosh. Chief Oshkosh was one of their treaty era leaders, and he is credited with laying out a vision for sustainable forestry that essentially says start from one end of the reservation and work towards the other end, and basically take the mature trees, the sick trees, the trees that have fallen, and when you reach the end of the reservation, you can turn around to do it again. And that's basically a very early vision for how the Menominee have been thinking about sustainable forest management. Again, this is cutting trees and milling into lumber in the mid 1800s, when the reservations were established. I do a lot of research thinking about, well, how does sustainability change? And so I'm trying to track the story of Menominee sustainability here in this short presentation. In 1890, the Menominee got a federal law passed that limited timber harvesting on their forest. It limited the harvesting to 20 million board feet. And 1890, that's before the Forest Service. It's before we have forestry schools. It's kind of around the time that this stuff is starting, but it's before that, 1890. It's the first law I can see that limits timber harvesting. And essentially it's codifying sustainable forestry for the Menominee. I point to that and say, this is where sustainable forestry started in the United States. Again, harvesting and making timber, making lumber out of timber, 1890. For the federal government at that time, the idea was to change our tribes into farmers, right? So the federal government wanted this kind of law to slowly ease Menominee into farming. And they thought 20 million board feet at a time over a period, 10, 20 years, Menominee will slowly become farmers. And it won't be abrupt, so it won't be disruptive to their community. And the government viewed Menominee as kind of separate from the US society. So they thought that they needed extra time to become farmers. For the Menominee, however, this was great. This was actually codifying this vision that Chief Oshkosh had laid out, right? 20 million board feet limited. It's not going to clear cut like everything else that was happening at the time. And so for the Menominee, this could actually implement that vision forever, that the trees would last forever. That's a quote that you hear. And so as we move forward in time, 1906, 1910, we have another law that further says Menominee should have a limited harvest at 20 million board feet. And at that point, the federal government started realizing that Menominee should probably, that they were listening to Menominee and wanting to become foresters instead of farmers. And they helped set up a sawmill. So in the law, they said, we'll put money for a sawmill and make sure that Menominee people are working in the sawmill. Again, instead of making Menominee farmers, the federal government was starting to come around to Menominee being foresters, which is what Menominee wanted to do as their territory shrunk from, I don't know, 9 million acres or something like that down to 200,000 some acres, right? You have to, that's that change in economy, and forestry was going to be it. Today, Menominee harvest about 20 million board feet a year, which is almost, it's amazing, right? They've been doing that essentially since the 1890s, 20 million board feet a year, more or less. And the goals, if you look at the management plans, talk to the foresters, there are really two overarching goals that play together. One, to produce high quality saw timber, and two, to promote the diversity of species, right? So they want to maintain diversity to enhance sort of cultural values. So you have all the pieces of the forest and the different ecological stages of succession. You've got diversity of forest for healthy wildlife, plants, etc. And that's been the driving force. And all these values, cultural values around that Menominee have had for generations, really for thousands and thousands of years on this landscape. These cultures, their culture is able to be sustained by this forest management. Now I'll switch real briefly to just talk about some of the values. So I've done a lot of oral history interviews with Menominee people, asking them about, why do you do forestry? What's the reason around your forest management? And four things come out really clearly when you talk to people. One is that forestry has really allowed them to establish and maintain tribal sovereignty in terms of protecting their forest. So again, in the 1890s, where they first got that limit, the Great Lakes were being cut over. That was the peak of volume coming out of the Great Lakes. And Menominee are sitting there saying, we can do this in a different way. They protected their forest using forest management, cutting trees, milling timber. Another value that comes out of interviews that I've done is that forestry is really important for jobs and income, right? It's supported people through this whole time period, supported people in a way that really, if you ask some, you'll hear forestry is the backbone of our economy. The mill, that sawmill is still there. They're still running it. It's upgraded now, obviously, from 1910, but it's still in the same place. It's still milling timber. It's really the backbone of the economy and the community. Another value that Menominee talk about when they're explaining why they're doing forestry is because of this sovereignty, because it's protecting the forest, because they're getting jobs and income. Forestry is promoting community well-being. It's providing all those opportunities for healthcare, education, and not just formal education, but education in terms of cultural education. So they're able to engage in the cultural activities that they've always engaged in because they have the forest that's intact. So community well-being is another value. And then the final one, and this goes to the core of sustainability, I think, irregardless of your culture, this idea that sustainability has to do with future generations. So forestry has allowed and does allow the Menominee tribe to maintain forests, provide opportunities for those future generations. They're protecting that forest for them. Now, another thing I wanted to mention real quick is that you'll never have, I've never heard Menominee people say no harvesting period. I worked for the Forest Service for about 20 years, and I heard a lot of people say, don't harvest anything, right? Don't do any harvest. I don't hear that in the Menominee community. And that's because of this history of using forestry to protect the land. You'll hear people argue about where to do it, how intense you're going to do it, how do you sell the timber, and all of that. But you're not going to hear people say, don't cut trees, because at the core in this moment in time, because of this history, Menominee people are really foresters. So I think I'm pretty much out of time here, and I look forward to discussing Indian forestry with you all. Thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thank you, Mike. Excellent points, and glad that our three panelists seem to be, in a good mindset together, even looking, appreciate the questions that are coming in, but I think at this time, to kind of do a wrap up, I've been taking a notes with some of panelists' comments, themes, maybe some things that I didn't fill in, but one of the most, I think the most important thing that I know Mike has mentioned and Tim, Don is almost the first things that they talked about was sovereignty. That the tribes are governments and they're not a stakeholder. That's one thing. As students that are viewing this go out into the tribal or the forestry professions, or if they say they work with the Forest Service, you always think about getting input from input, and you'll hear about stakeholders and management plans. But the one thing that the tribes are a government and have control over, especially if they're with treaty rights, and they as Mike mentioned, this was all tribal land at one time, and there was sovereign agreements between tribes, usually in a custom areas is what we called, even with our fishing and hunting areas. But that was one of the themes that everybody was mentioning, and that's, I didn't get too much in, I didn't want to cover too much in the governance because I would be going on for days, I think, talking about the relationship. But that was the one important thing, was the sovereignty. And because of the doctrine of discovery and the federal government was in control, or trying to civilize, as Mike mentioned, about trying to make farmers out of a forestry community, and trying to control and civilize that. And it wasn't in the 1950s, there was a termination period. In fact, there was 100 tribes that were terminated. Menominee was one of the tribes that was terminated in 1950s, excuse me. And also 100 tribes in Oregon and Northern California. There were 60 tribes in Oregon and 40 tribes in California that were terminated. And the one word, especially the other word besides the sovereignty, the next word was restoration, because that was the next step of going from reservation to termination to restoration. Those are some of the words that were a common theme that we're hearing right now. And it wasn't until the 1993 638 Self-Determination Act, it wasn't until the middle 70s that the federal government affirmed that tribes did have sovereign control over their lands, and even with the funding, that the money used to go through just the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the programs were run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and after the Self-Determination Act, tribes had more control over their lands, and Don was mentioning that their self-determination, and I know Yurok is with that, and Menominee. And so it hasn't been that long since tribes have actually been able to form their government, especially working relationships, and the restoration, the sovereignty, restoration, and then the third word, I guess, the words that we were hearing was partnerships. That was the next thing, that when tribes finally did get control over their forests and develop their plans, the next thing was actually being able to establish partnerships, control of the funding, and with the control over funding, it was easier to establish those partnerships and do these type of matching partnerships and funds to become a true government. So it's only been about 45 years, and compared the United States government's been over 200 years with its government working, and the tribes have only been going on 50 years. So that's why when you look at this restoration and landscape management with tribes, you have to understand that the tribes are still establishing and building even their workforce. When I started 45 years ago, there was nine Indian foresters nationwide, and now there's about 300. So in those 40 years, it's grown, and it's great to see people like Don and Tim and Mike out there, because there was only 9 of us when I started out. It's pretty overwhelming, and that's what really makes me feel good, is how much it's grown. So we'll go ahead, and I'll start with some of the questions that we have. And I guess we'll have, working with priority, maybe start this one with Mike. I'm going into environmental policy and would be curious to hear from everyone what laws, local, state, federal, could be changed to implement to make it easier for tribes to manage the way they want to. Maybe start with Mike, I guess, with that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many laws necessarily need to be changed, but I think to be aware of some of the different laws that tribes are operating under. The Indian Forest Management Act, that's a big one. I think that was 1990. Don, you could probably correct me on that.
Yeah.
Indian Forest Management Act kind of dictates how tribes will do forestry on the reservations. And then because all of our lands were once tribal lands, our tribes across the country have a real interest, and you've heard it from the speakers, a real interest in how the federal lands are managed. And not only is it an interest because those were the tribal lands that were taken into federal control, but the federal government has a legal, moral, and ethical responsibility to work with tribes. So partnership is a big theme. So understanding how those federal lands are managed and what the federal obligation and legal obligation is to consult with tribes, so we can get from legally consulting to some place where we're actually collaborating either as equals or putting tribes in the forefront with our management of those federal lands. So learning those federal laws, so you have the Forest Management Act, you have National Environmental Policy Act, and kind of digging into that. Don mentioned the Indian Forest Management Team Assessment, IFMAT. Those are really nice to look at because it outlines, there's 3 of them so far, I believe, every 10 years. It summarizes the state of Indian forestry, and you'll learn a lot there as well.
Thanks, Mike. Tim, did you have any ideas with any?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And if I had a magic wand, I'd change a lot of things. In California, well, we're in a unique position because we have, as I mentioned, tribal trust lands that we manage and work with the BIA, for instance. And we're we have to comply with NEPA and all that, and we've of course have a forest management plan in place as well. So we work with the under federal regulations for those trust lands. In our case, we're purchasing privately held lands both on the reservation, which is a little clearer, so we can work with with the BIA and our federal partners to manage those tribally owned fee lands under federal regulations. Our off-reservation fee lands, though, are really, we're really under state jurisdiction, and that's a real challenge for us. So, we're looking at strategies to eventually either, assume tribal jurisdiction, either through, converting to trust lands in the future. We're looking at potentially congressional, level legislation to expand the reservation boundaries. One strategy we're using is working with the BIA to register those lands under their sustained yield unit authority, I think that's called. So we're looking at ways to, not bypass state laws, but to work well, to assume either tribal jurisdiction or work under federal, regulatory authority. So, yeah, in our case, working with the state's tough. In California, we've got very strict, very tough, forest practice rules. I guess the toughest in the nation, and so it's difficult. There's a lot of challenges there, to comply with that, and so we're working with CDF, for instance, Cal Fire here in California, to develop timber harvest plans, and it's a lot of red tape. So yeah, it is a challenge. I think from our perspective, though, assuming tribal jurisdiction is the route we want to take, and ultimately expand the reservation borders and convert those lands to trust lands.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Don, did you have any magic wand? Don Blake, any laws or ideas or the magic wand?
I keep leaving my mute on by accident, but Mike had mentioned something that struck me, and that was the consultation that's really important for the federal government to participate with tribes. And so I've been in a few of those consultations, and I'm pretty just really seems like it seems like a lot of lip service and going down a checkbox, and I think that's been a little bit of my inexperience, but I really have pressed to my tribe that we can't let other people define this consultation. The consultation needs to be really bolstered to actually mean something, and the check boxes don't really mean something. I feel like a lot of times we're approached and the plan is already made, and we weren't in the original plan to begin with, and so the checkbox doesn't really mean anything by the time the consultation happens. So I think that I'd like to see something change with consultation so that it's more meaningful.
Thanks, Don Blake. That's really important because I've also experienced that when Don mentions just a checkbox, what happens when you go to meetings with federal agencies, they're looking input. Sometimes they view tribes just as a stakeholder, and we will just take your input, but there's not a response that tribes will provide input into a project. And when the report or feedback when it comes back, you won't see your input there. Or in a sense, it's like a dissenting opinion, or this was an opinion. It should have a statement, say either UROC or UPA made a comment on an option of a project, and this was their input on this option. But you never hear that back from the federal agency sometimes. Great. Well, we have some pretty big ones here. Oh, these are probably, this is relating, maybe this is for Tim and Don, talking about some fire things, but this question is, what are the panelists' perspective on recent calls to return land management to the tribes, who many believe would be better stewards and would be better to prevent things like the tidal waves of fires in California through better forest management? What are the realities of a handover like this, staffing and funding to the tribes? What is needed to take meaningful steps in this direction? If people want to give back their land but still live on it, how would they go about it, and how would they address it with their local tribes? So it's kind of the give the land back to the Indians topic. So I don't know if Don or Tim wanted to start with that.
I think that we do
I'll
a
try.
pretty good job.
Oh, yeah, go for it, Don.
Well,
I
you're
think
back
we do a
up.
pretty good in
You're on.
our management. We do a good job in our management, and I think that, as you had mentioned earlier, we do it pretty efficiently with less money. We actually need more money to be able to do it. We're, barely able to get done what we can. But I think that it's the values that lend to everything we do. It's important. It's our vested interest in protecting the land that is ultimately going to sustain us. So, we live on a small portion of our Aboriginal territory. And so to expand out to that and be able to efficiently manage outside of the borders of our reservation is definitely a goal and something that we'd like to achieve.
Yeah, and I'd say that too. I was just going to say, yeah, okay, sure. No, I think partnerships are really key to that, and I think in our case, in Urox and Hoopa, we're surrounded by a lot of federal lands, either Forest Service lands or Redwood National Park, and so there's opportunities to work with our federal partners and trustees to to expand on that, expand beyond that consultation, level of working together into more of a co-management partnership. And I think, I think the tribes, in a lot of cases, do have a lot of experience with cultural burning and more traditional land management that, really could be applied on federal lands. In terms of working with private lands, that's again, really strong partnerships. I mentioned we work with the Western Rivers Conservancy, so there are groups out there that work to acquire lands, set up conservation agreements with private landowners and others. And I think it's really those partnerships that I think would be key to making something like that happen. Of course, the tribes have challenges with capacity, but there's a lot of expertise there, and I think they could really share and develop some strong partnerships. So yeah, I think it's a great that people are talking about it. At least there's a lot of really good knowledge that I think tribes can bring to the table. So
Thanks, Tim and Don. I just wanted to, part of the governance, or one thing that was passed in 2004, there was a Tribal Forest Protection Act that allowed tribes to do, and Don Blake had mentioned stewardship contracts, but they did those stewardship contracts under the Tribal Forest Protection Act, where tribes are allowed to do contracting on federal lands, Forest Service land, BLM, but also the latest Farm Bill has allowed tribes to do what they call 638 contracting with the forest. This is the first time that tribal contracting, the funding between the Forest Service and the tribe, goes directly between the tribe and the Forest Service. That's never been done on a government-to-government basis. It's been done with the Department of Interior has done it, but not the Department of Agriculture. So that's something that's just come about, where there's workshops going on and contracting workshops to promote that, where there's more direct connection between the tribe and the Forest Service. And also there's been some legislation proposed where they call it the Tribal Forest Protection and Participation Act, where there is management by the tribe, or looking at maybe some pilot projects of utilizing the tribal interior environmental process. That there would need to be a lot of discussion about how something like would be implemented like that on Forest Service land, but that's something that's under being looked into. Okay, we've got another question. We've got a lot of good questions. I hope we could get to most of these, but these are again for both Northern California tribal members. Are lands that you have been repatriating generally second growth forests? If so, how does that affect your management plan? Can they speak about who they work with outside the tribe on their programs? How are they tied with the rest of the timber? How are they tied with the rest of the timber industry?
I guess I'll take that one. So yes, most of the repatriated lands that the Yurok tribe has reacquired are definitely were once industrial, commercial timberlands. So there's a lot of second and third growth, timber stands. A lot of those units, it was even age management land. So we're really our strategy. We have two main land management strategies, and we have what we're calling the Yurok Community Forest, which are essentially we're managing for carbon sequestration, but also these other multiple uses, cultural access and cultural resources, but also in the long term, sustainable, timber. And then we've also got a 15,000 acre parcel I didn't mention earlier that we're developing into what we're calling a forest and salmon sanctuary. So really using, forest treatments, thin and release, and other forest health projects to accelerate transition to an old growth forest habitat. And so that, for fish, for wildlife, so that's really unique. So yes, it's, we're looking at the long-term vision. We're going to be here forever. And for us, we got, we want to manage for carbon, put people to work, do good things for the land, but also want to, preserve some of that too and develop an old growth forest, coastal redwood forest. So.
Okay.
Yeah, and partnerships are the key to that. So,
Don, maybe you could mention. I know, or maybe Don Blake can mention some of the partners they've had, or maybe you did mention some of the wildlife partnerships.
Wildlife partnerships. Okay. I was just in the process of muting, so we work closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's not really a partnership. We consult with them for the timber sale process. We partnered with the Bureau of Land Management. Some partnerships, I guess one that I forgot, and maybe you were leading me into this, but we've had a partnership with the Yurok tribe with their condor, with their endeavors to release the condor back into their native habitat. The two wildlife departments worked together. They actually came onto the Hoopa Reservation and collected data on ravens and turkey vultures. And I had the opportunity to go out with the Yurok tribal biologists and doing that. Other partnerships are with the Forest Service. We're in partnership with the Forest Service right now for fuels reduction, because that's important to Forest Service right now. They're wanting to remove some of their timber, but more for the purpose of fuels reduction. And the tribe really needs that area of the forest to be fire resilient, because it's adjacent to us and really threatens us when fire occurs in the wilderness area, and they're really hands off with the approach to attacking fire in the wilderness area. So then if the Forest Service can manage some of the landscape that's not tied up in the wilderness, that's adjacent to the reservation, and that really helps both parties. That's a good partnership.
Okay, thanks, Don. We've, let's see, a question for Mike Dockery here. What changes do you think need to take place within the undergraduate and other forestry education to encompass more holistic understanding of land management, as well as tribal forestry stewardship, as has been covered this evening?
I think we need every single natural resource graduate to understand something about tribes, treaties, whose land are you on, and those need to be infused into the curriculum. I teach a tribal natural resource management class. This is the first semester I'm doing that. Had a pretty good, there's 50 students in it, really a lot of interest from the students, because what's happening is students know that when they graduate, they're gonna have to work with tribes. They're gonna have to know about consultation. They're gonna have to, anything we do, this partnership theme is not going away. It's good for the federal government because they don't have the funds that they need. It's good for the tribes because tribes don't have the funds they need. So partnerships that's the future. And if you don't know anything about tribes, which we really haven't taught that, you're at a disadvantage starting off. And so I feel like I spent my 20-year career with the Forest Service teaching people how to work with tribes. And then I thought, well, why don't I do this before they graduate? Start teaching students so you graduate at least with a little bit of information about how to find what are your responsibilities, what are the treaties, who are the tribes in the area, what are the issues that tribes say are important to them. You're hearing a lot about wildlife and forestry, a lot about climate change and forest management. So these are issues that are really important for our tribes. Yeah, so I'd like to see that. I'd like to see more faculty members. So either tribal faculty members or faculty members that are working closely with tribes. And then I'd like to see support for students. I'll get on my high horse a little bit here, but I hope people have seen the High Country News Land Grab Universities report and database. That shows our land grant universities are built on the backs of tribal communities, are built from the lands. All these lands we're talking about helped establish all of our land grant universities. And the universities themselves need to start having serious discussions about the responsibilities that they have for this legacy, that it's not something in the past. It's not like 10 generations of farmers that have taken Indian lands a long time ago. This is endowments today. This is land today. And so I think our universities need to figure out what we're going to do in respect to tribes. And I think funding students, funding faculty, and then making sure that the students have classes so they understand tribal values and understand tribal needs.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Mike. I'm going down. We've got time for probably a couple more questions. And this one's for Tim, because I'm kind of curious about this one too, or since you're working on carbon. This question is for Tim. Follow up on carbon. Is managing for carbon sequestration profitable enough considering the price of carbon is so low?
Yes, it is. And there has been a real impact in the last 6 months on California carbon markets. Not to get down to, it's really complicated and of course driven by energy markets. But of course, we're committed. The Yurok tribe is really committed to this, and up until the COVID pandemic, things were looking really good. We've developed some really good partnerships again, working with some really good folks, potentially developing not just what's called compliance offset marketing, but also with voluntary in the voluntary markets, working with green companies and others, and really that's a direction that we want to continue to expand and work on, supporting really good businesses and other groups that have shared values with the tribe. There has been a big impact on the carbon market, and but we see this as a long-term investment in the tribe, and we're gonna stick it out, and we're hopeful that that through the policy making and the markets, things will get better. So yes, it's paid the bills to date. So let's put it that way.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Here's the last question for the night, and of course, we can't forget about fire. And question is, how has Yurok and Hoopa incorporated prescribed fire into their forest management, if at all? How might like an organization, Blue Forest Conservation, support tribes through policies that can help support the application of prescribed fire to the landscape?
Don, do you want to take this one?
I keep leaving my mute on. Forget about that. As part of our forest management, we do prescribed burns for basketry materials, and we really would like to get fire back on the landscape altogether, to the place where we can just go out and light a fire in the forest and let it go. That was the way that we were taught to do the fire, and just keep it on a schedule like that. But to be able to essentially just take a match and light the forest up and let the fire do what it's going to do. We're so far away from that right now that it takes a lot of money to be able to do a prescribed burn. And there's just so many levels of bureaucracy that we have to go through currently in order to get fire on the ground. So as desperately as we want it, it's really been a hard thing. But our tribe does do the cultural burns annually, but we feel like that's just a tiny portion of what we really want to do eventually.
Yeah, and I agree. Yeah, the Yurok tribe, we're working really closely with the community. There's some grassroots community groups here in the area that are really active and want to promote cultural burning, both on private lands and on tribal lands. So we're working really closely with them. We really need to catch up in a lot of cases with those groups. The tribe, we're working hard to develop our capacity, we're developing a fire department, and then working to integrate fire into our overall land management planning. So as Don mentioned, there are a lot of challenges with funding, permitting, planning, but I think our strategy is work with the community, provide that support and leadership, and then of course integrate it really into all of our forest management, both for actively burning and using fire, but also with fuels treatments, shaded fuel breaks, even with planning out our road decommissioning strategy and stuff. So really planning and integrating it with everything that we do, I think, is our strategy. And then hopefully all those other things will come, like funding, will come into place. So, thank you.
Thanks, Tim, Don, Blake, and Mike Dockery. Just maybe a closing word. I know on fire, when I took some, when I was working at Spokane, I took some of the tribal, or Eastern Washington University, they had a Spokane tribal language class, and your final for the class was actually prepare a meal. That was, you're supposed to describe in your tribal language how you prepared a meal, and the better meal, more complicated words, or mixing the words, telling a story, the better grade you got when you did your final for the class. But the very first thing, and my dad who did the helped do the dictionary for Umatilla, was the very first word you think about in the morning. When you get up in the morning, what do? You turn on the light, the flame. When you fix your meal, you start the fire. So some of the first words that we learned as kids anyway was fire, water. That's the next thing. Our creation stories are tied to fire. So it's fire, water, food, and how each tribe develops its language is really some of the values, and water and fire are really key elements in our creation stories. So that's maybe as a closing word is our tribe, we choosh is our amen, which is water, how we bless our meals. So I guess with that tonight, I've got my cup that is choosh. And thank you very much. And we'll have the closing out with David.
Thank
Oh,
you.
Don, thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful closing moment to note the importance of a meal where most hall lectures would be followed by a dinner with our Cal alumni. And we're so sorry we're not doing that, but it's a Friday evening. I'm sure many of you are headed off to enjoy a meal, and I hope you're with friends and family and safe in this exceptionally difficult time. Don, thank you again for coming in on such short notice. Tim and Mike and Don, that was a really insightful discussion. I learned so much. I'm sure there's others in the audience who found this just a really unique opportunity to hear directly from those of you who are at the forefront of tribal forestry. There were so many other questions that we didn't get to. I just want to apologize to anyone who we didn't get your question asked, and I think that just speaks to how much interest there is in our community in this discussion. So on behalf of Berkeley's forestry program, I want to offer an invitation for continued engagement and dialogue. Mike noted the recent report by High Country News. We're also very engaged in discussions in the UC system about the tribal lands, the land grant legacy. Those of you who've looked at the report know that an enormous fraction of the lands that went into the land grant system across the entire country were in fact in California. And of course, there were California tribal lands, not just for the University of California. So this is a topic of great interest. Some of you may know Professor Scott Stevens and Kent Lightfoot. Scott's in our college, Kent Lightfoot in anthropology, teamed up a couple of years ago to design a class about Indigenous fire and forest management. And that class has become enormously popular each time they offered it, and really, again, spoken to the student interest. I'm also especially pleased to share, for those of you who haven't heard all our recent news, the Environmental Sciences Policy and Management Department, where forestry is located, has recently hired 2 tribal faculty members, Elizabeth Hoover, who works on tribal food security, and Peter Nelson, who will be starting soon, who works in Indigenous archaeology and in resource management. And we are so excited about the contributions they will bring to our research and teaching and mentoring in our programs. Again, I want to thank the Hall family for their continued participation, their support in the S.J. Hall lecture. Thank you for being with us this evening. I love to hear from all of you. I love to hear from our alumni. You're always welcome to reach out to me and to give us your feedback on our programming and the future of our programs. I invite you all to come back again next year, hopefully in person, maybe virtually. We never seem to know these days, for the annual S.J. Hall lecture in industrial forestry. Stay safe and go Bears. Good night, everyone.